Hello, I'm Ron Kingham, Executive Director of the Environment and Development Resource Centre, and welcome to this reportage of the 14th meeting of the Brussels Dialogue on Climate Diplomacy.
Co-organized by EDRC and GLOBE-EU on 28 March 22, the aim of the meeting was to provide insight into the interlinkages between climate change and biodiversity loss, both in terms of the interconnected challenges and of the need to address the two threats to environmental and human security together in a more coordinated way. Our distinguished speakers were Margrete Auken, Member of the European Parliament and Member of GLOBE-EU, András Wijkman and András Báldi on behalf of ESAC, Veronika Šafránková on behalf of UNEP, and Alberto Schnell from the IUCN. You will find more information about this meeting, including some essential reading material, on our website at brusselsdialogue.net/events. Our first speaker was Margrete Auken from the European Parliament and member of GLOBE-EU, and she was asked to speak about the security implications of climate change and biodiversity loss.
Honored to be in this panel here, and of course my contributions will be a little bit more based on what we see just for the moment happening around us. But so I'm looking forward to have lots of learning from you. I'm not the one to tell you how interlinked biodiversity and climate is. I think everybody here is aware, but everybody around us is not aware. It is absolutely my feeling that when I tell people that without having, without addressing biodiversity or rich nature, or what you call it, at the same time as you address the risk to the climate, you will not solve this here. And it's a knowledge which has been available. I remember from COP21 in Paris, I had a long meeting with, at that time, the Secretary General from the UN panel on biodiversity, and he was at that time quite frustrated that it has such a low priority in Paris. But I think since then, it is, when perhaps even due to Greta Thunberg has been so eager to stress this again and again, that people are now aware of that we should fight for nature at the same time, not only for the sake of nature, not only for the sake of a wonderful life and so on, but also for the sake of the climate. It is so needed, and that the depletion of nature is much faster than most people are aware of, and that's really, it's not only a sad story, it's very dangerous. And what we see now is also that the security, I'm also of course talking of human food safety and so on and so forth, because that's obvious. But we can also see what was also visible when we were in Paris in 2015, that the military security is at stake. Some of you might remember that Pentagon was quite present at that conference in Paris, because they were at that time very much aware that this here is risky, as IPCC later came forward with a report on what happens to conflicts, wars, refugees, and so on and so forth, when we have this loss of nature, loss of farmland, loss of we have extreme weather, drought, we have floods and so on. And then we have seen recently, just I would say last week, we experienced here in the European Parliament and in member states too, that the agro-industrial complex managed to make an enormous kickback to the whole green transition, when they called for, we need more food production due to the lack of food, grains, wheat and so on from Ukraine and from Russia. Then we must, stop with all these pesticides limitations, all these not having set aside land for itself and so on. You might have seen how bad it went, and there was a big majority in the council. I think this proposal on not cultivating set-aside land was only my own country, Denmark, who voted against. We are also probably in the worst situation in Denmark. But still, I was quite shocked. And we saw that the Commission would postpone the biodiversity strategy. They would postpone also the pesticide strategy. And it was shocking with which speed, world leaders and majority in the parliament, not to talk about our weak Commission, just came forward with this here. So I think that we all of us need to be very much aware of what security is, not only a healthy life, not only a wonderful life for my 8 grandchildren, it's for the immediate safety that we need to speed this up for nature at the same time as we do the best we can to stop the climate change. Thank you.
It's very nice to be back in the context of GLOBE and GLOBE-EU. I should perhaps add that I think I represent in particular today ESAC, the European Academies of Science, that have put up 3 panels to guide and give advice to the European institutions. And we recently produced a paper where we pointed at the intricate links between the Climate Convention and the Biodiversity Convention. The challenge today, in my view, is that this kind of need for systemic approaches is such a problem because of the way society is organized. We are very good at breaking down complex things in their different parts, but we are very bad at understanding the whole and how things indeed are interlinked, interdependent, and interconnected. Science is organized in disciplines and subdisciplines. And of course, we need specialists, but we also need to understand systems. And the way both science and society in general is organized is, in my view, a huge problem. We rely on silo-based institutions, and they are often, unfortunately, a barrier to addressing complexity and systemic problems. There are indeed many examples about the interconnectedness between climate change and healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. For instance, when tropical forests are replaced by agriculture, biodiversity is lost at the same time as stored carbon is released, and thereby reducing the carbon uptake in the land. When temperatures warm and associated changes in precipitation occur, agriculture productivity is reduced, and at the same time species are being moved outside of their habitable range, in some cases driven to extinction. Another example is that when oceans are warming and getting more acidic, the ocean's capacity to absorb and remove carbon from the atmosphere is being reduced, while at the same time shifting or degrading ecosystems. Another example is using biomass for bioenergy, if not done in a careful and measured way, may worsen climate change and indeed reduce biodiversity. At the same time, we know that conserving, managing, and restoring ecosystems can mitigate climate change and enable adaptation to its impacts while enhancing biodiversity. So there are trade-offs as well as synergies with regard to climate change and climate mitigation, and the loss, but also the protection of biodiversity. Hence, in my view, policies to fight climate change has to take into the account the effects on biodiversity and vice versa. And the ideal thing would be to merge the two conventions and work more in tandem. and policy that simultaneously address synergies between mitigating biodiversity loss and climate change, while at the same time considering their societal impacts, offer the opportunity to maximize co-benefits. For too long has these two agendas been separated and not talked about together. I understand that there have been workshops between the two conventions recently, and I think that's very positive. We know pretty well, and let me end by this, what the main drivers are with regard to climate change and biodiversity loss. Fossil fuels, deforestation, expansion of agriculture, and indeed industrial agriculture system practices. One aspect, however, that is most often not specifically addressed is material use. I'm a member of the International Resource Panel, a UN body whose task it is to monitor all kinds of natural resource uses. In our most recent major report, Global Resources Outlook 2019, many crucially important points are made. Material use, and here we talk about biomass, fossil fuels, metals and minerals, has more than tripled since 1970 and continue to increase, and indeed increase faster than the growth of the global economy. And now comes the interesting thing. More than 50% of carbon emissions are linked to the extraction and processing of materials, and as much as 90% of biodiversity loss. Now then you ask yourself, what drives material use? Well, of course, material consumption. So ultimately, it's our lifestyles and our consumption patterns that we have to look at. And material consumption is very unevenly distributed. The material footprint in Sweden, my country, is around 27 tons per capita in a year. In Africa, south of Sahara, the same footprint is 2 tons. So we know one thing, we cannot continue to increase human footprints decade after decade. And the footprint of low-income countries have to increase, while the footprints of rich countries have to be reduced. So let's leave that particular issue and question for the discussion. Thank you very much.
I would like to talk about the interdependent solutions regarding ecosystems. My 2 keywords are maintenance and restoration of ecosystems. My starting point is the same as András Wijkman had, that actually we are one system, nature and people together live on Earth. But for operative actions and policy targets, we have specific, narrow, not connected targets. So we need to reunite biodiversity and climate, mainly because biodiversity is the list of species, among others, and there is one species, Homo sapiens, which are us. So we are talking about our own well-being. So maintenance and restoration. So what maintenance means here? It's very easy to protect and manage effectively the ecosystems. Stop afforestation. Stop draining and converting wetlands and peatlands to degraded ecosystems. If we do that, the stored carbons will be released from these systems, and large part of the global carbon store is in these ecosystems. And meanwhile, we will lose the rich forest and wetland biodiversity, the unique specialist species which give the character of these areas. And these unique species lists from given forest types and wetland types and so on will change to a generalist species pool with many exotic species, which means that there will be many similar species throughout these systems, and the original pattern of different systems, the diversity will disappear. It's very easy to link this maintenance conservation to the protected area systems, because those give the natural choice to do this protection, management, and maintenance actions to combat climate change and conserve biological diversity. My other point is on restoration, which is more expensive, because here we need to restore the original natural or semi-natural habitats on degraded lands. Just to give you an example, let's say from a biodiversity point of view, urban areas, cities, villages are degraded land because it's full of concrete, asphalt, cement, and buildings, so human things, and the biological diversity is low. But if we start to restore some kind of natural vegetation, planting trees or green roof or so on, then we can achieve a win-win situation. Trees will capture carbon, will cool the city, because instead of black asphalt, you will get shadow from the trees. On the trees there will be birds and insects and epiphytes, so biological diversity will increase. And again, don't forget that we are also part of biological diversity, we humans, and it's there are many evidence that green areas increase our mental health. So our mental health is really depends on what kind of nature is around us. But I also have to make a note that it's not as easy as I describe it here, because it depends on where are you on Earth, which climate, tropical, subtropical, temperate, what kind of tree species you want to plant in the city, and also what is the local ecological, sociological context. If the local people used to cut trees to burn the timber, then you don't really make a wise decision if you want to plant trees there. And another, let's say, cautionary note on restoration, that it can be very good in terms of benefiting both combating climate and saving biological diversity, but there can be, let's say, bad decision and bad solution. Imagine that we start to plant trees, one type of tree species, which is an exotic hybrid tree species, which was widespread practice across, globally and also in Europe. And we turn some kind of, let's say, unused habitat to it, let's say semi-natural grasslands, then we really make a bad decision, because although there will be some kind of benefit for climate, but we lost the carbon stored in the semi-natural grassland, and we will simply erase the high biodiversity value of the original habitats there. We will lose plant species, we will lose bees, butterflies, birds which are living there, and naturalness simply will decline and eliminated. So I think there are many more examples, and there are very good examples how we can combat both among the problems in one step. But these are, like the hammer. You can use it to build a house, but you can also use it to smash a house. So it's very important to make clear what we want to achieve and how we want to do that. Thank you very much.
For the invitation, and it is a pleasure for me to be in such a panel. I will come to your question, and I know that I have only 5 minutes, but I wanted to start with broader picture a little bit. And András already mentioned some of the key data, but I think it's important to realize how interconnected all these issues are. And András mentioned some of the data, but it is very alarming. So let me go back a little bit to that. Over the last 50 years, trade has grown 10 times. The global economy has grown 5 times, and the world population has doubled, now 7.8 billion people. We heard the extraction number. It's tripled over the past 50 years. That accounts for more than 90% of our biodiversity loss. The species are from the world's estimated 8 million species of plants and animals, 1 million out of them is threatened with extinction. Prosperity has doubled, but still 1.3 billion people remain poor and 700 million are hungry. I could carry on with those figures, but it's clear that the exploitation of nature has reached unsustainable levels and is undermining the Earth's capacity to sustain human well-being. It is existential. And with this, I wanted to just illustrate that we are talking about triple planetary crisis. We are talking about the climate change, biodiversity loss, but also pollution, which is also a major crisis. It is important, and that's what I was citing these numbers, that we talk about this interconnectedness, and it is very much linked to current unsustainable patterns of consumption and production. So if we want to tackle the crisis, we have to improve improve the health of the environment, as well as social and economic health, which has been shown by the COVID-19 crisis as well. These numbers that I cited are in different reports. We tried, as UNEP, bring the assessments together with the synthesis report, Making Peace with Nature, which is looking at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the Global Environment Outlook, and so on. So it is a very comprehensive set of data. We can see the numbers and we can see how it is all linked together. Needless to say, I'm sure we all follow that, the recent IPCC report in February, and also the latest report on spreading like wildfire, all giving very clear evidence on that. Now, you mentioned the institutional response. I would also bring attention of the United Nations Environment Assembly that met 3 weeks ago in Nairobi, reaching agreement on 14 resolutions that are exactly addressing the triple planetary crisis. One of the highlights I would mention is the resolution to end plastic pollution. The aim is to negotiate international legally binding instruments to tackle plastic pollution. I would mention also biodiversity and health. That was also in one of the background documents. Sustainable and resilient infrastructure, nature-based solutions, and to discuss the internationally accepted definition of nature-based solutions and many other elements also responding to COVID-19 recovery, enhancing circular economy, and as contribution to achieving sustainable consumption and production. These outcomes from UNEP are very important for the forthcoming work, and you mentioned the COP15 and COP27 and the links between these two. Well, for a long time, there was a large disconnection between the climate and biodiversity crisis. Now, with the COP26 in Glasgow, we could see that biodiversity got there. At COP26, 137 world leaders committed to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. So this is a big step that at the climate COP, we already had biodiversity. We need to connect the COP15 with climate as well. And you mentioned the Geneva talks. They are still taking place this week. It started last week. And the importance is they are very critical to develop ambitious transformative post-2020 framework and accelerate the progress efforts that are very much needed for safeguarding the health of our planet. The COP15 will be later in 2022, but these preparatory meetings that are taking place in these 2 weeks are extremely important to prepare for the COP15. I know that I'm probably running out of my 5 minutes, but I wanted to bring the attention to some of the key issues that I see. It was mentioned before that one of the problems that we had, and we still have, is that we don't connect the issues and we work in silos, and that environment and climate is taking as environment and climate. It should not be like that. It should be amongst the decision-making process in all sectors. It needs to be with agriculture sector, transport sector, finance. So it's not a matter of environment ministers. It should be very much embedded in the agenda of, let's say, ministers of finance. It should be at the core of the whole governmental policy, not only environmental policy. We need science at the heart of all the discussions, and not only the discussions at COP15, COP27, you name it, but at the political decision-making process. It needs to be political priority, and we heard it at the beginning that climate has achieved the level of political priority. We need biodiversity to be political priority, and we need pollution to be political priority. So we need the mainstreaming in the decision-making process, in the policy and the actions, and we need ambitious and coordinated action by everybody, by all stakeholders, governments in the forefront, but also businesses, academic institutions, financial institutions, civil society, everybody. So we need all these elements in the decision-making process, and I must say that I was very pleased to see the Council conclusions of the Foreign Affairs Ministers in February on climate diplomacy and preparing for the COP27, that is bringing to the climate diplomacy also the element of biodiversity and the climate biodiversity environmental degradation nexus, so that is really important to have at this level, at the Foreign Affairs Ministers, also this discussion and this connection. And I'm happy to go to some of the elements in more detail, but probably at a later stage, and I'll stop now. Thank you, Ron.
I bring actually 2 points here that I would like to help or add into the discussion that might help to have a more provocative discussion later on, and also a final reflection. First of all, yes, I know that the political agenda has been tackled in several occasions previously. I just want to mention about how we are now in the situation that we have biodiversity high in the agenda, which is very different from how it was before. In 1992, when we had the Rio Convention approved, at the time, climate was not as high in the agenda as it became actually only 1 decade afterwards. So the interconnectedness of the different environmental issues was not that much considered at the time. Now, at the moment, we have both issues very much on top of the agenda. I'm sure you have heard a number of times Mr. Timmermans, the Executive Vice President of the Commission, mention the dual crisis, biodiversity loss and climate change. With the European Union level, actually, we have seen a number of very positive developments, I would say, to start with the European Union Green Deal of the President von der Leyen at that level, at the President von der Leyen, and also the responsible is, as I said before, the Executive Vice President Timmermans. Well, we have now one umbrella for all the environmental issues, and this is connecting in principle all the issues, and this is positive. It's not exactly perfect, as we know very well, and this discussion today is very timely to address it, but it's now under the same environmental political umbrella, which is very helpful. And by the way, this is also helping the connection between the different sectors, which is fundamental to ensure that we achieve these targets. I'm thinking in particular in agriculture, but many others need to be addressed to ensure that we really achieve these environmental targets. At global level, now climate change is also much more prominent in the draft global biodiversity framework that is being developed at the very moment. It is different from the Aichi targets. It was there, but now it is more prominent. So both agendas are slowly getting together, which is very positive, is what we need to have. Now, we still have a discussion that is unsolved. And as I said, the discussion today is exactly going in this direction. But all in all, we have a dual crisis, and now we accept it. This is a sign of the times, and I think it's important to start acknowledging that. The second point is, well, if we want to use this political momentum to put nature into the path to recovery, well, we have a very good tool at our disposal to address this dual crisis. And I'm referring to a concept that I'm sure you have heard and is very now typical, if you want, in the political discussion, nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions, I'm going to read the definition from IUCN from 2016, are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural and modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. This is the definition of IUCN, as I mentioned, and this is not new, this is from 2016, and actually this concept has been in the agenda of many organizations, but in particular of our agenda of IUCN since more than a decade at the moment. But now we have even much more clarity, because there is another definition from the United Nations that is only, I think, 2-3 weeks old. So now we have a global definition that we can start to use. I'm just coming actually from another event when there was a question about what is the definition of nature-based solution, because that will be important to start to move ahead. And it was exactly about agriculture. Well, that definition is out there. There is no need to discuss about it anymore. We have it. There is also new information out there that can help very much in the deployment of these nature-based solutions. And I'm referring to the IUCN standard on nature-based solutions from 2020. Again, a very good way to ensure that we really implement nature-based solutions in the right way. And there is also a political momentum that I would like to highlight in relation with nature-based solutions. As I mentioned, there is this UNEP definition, so now it's at very high level internationally. It's also very much mentioned by political actors at all levels. And in the European Union, they are actually mentioned in the context of the Green Deal in a number of different strategies. The biodiversity strategy, the farm-to-fork strategy, and even in the climate adaptation strategy, the nature-based solution standard is mentioned directly. Still, anyway, we don't have it mentioned at the draft global biodiversity framework that is being discussed at the very moment, something that we understand that will be different in future because it's a challenge that is not there at the moment. There are also some funding opportunities in relation with the political momentum of nature-based solutions that are important to highlight. In particular, I'm thinking in the European context on the Horizon funding lines that where nature-based solutions play an important role. But anyway, this still needs to be scaled up very much. And finally, a very short reflection also that maybe helps in the discussion that is happening now. We are living a lot of crises at the moment. The pandemic, now wars, the economic challenges that we know that are also attached to a number of the different challenges that I mentioned before. But we cannot ignore the underlying crises that we are anyway living, biodiversity and climate. So what will be, I will call it a disaster, is to have any action that goes against one or the other. So any action that in future we take should be both climate and biodiversity proofed, I will say. We have started with the climate for a while now, and I think that is working better than before. And now biodiversity is gaining momentum. This is great, because as I said, they are both at the same level, but we need to do much more. And this is, if you want, the final message. Biodiversity loss and climate change, they are both at the moment the two key crises from the environmental side that we need to learn how to tackle together.
Start by saying that I think it's quite extraordinary, to put it mildly, that 50 years after the limits to growth, we still have difficulties to really understand the importance of nature for as a life supporting system. I mean, the Club of Rome report in 1972 made the point very clearly that on a finite planet, you cannot continue to expand material consumption decade after decade after decade. The report at that time was ridiculed, in particular by neoclassical economists. They told us you have not counted in or factored in the ingenuity of mankind, imagination, innovation, etc. But the fact is that today, unfortunately, the standard or business as usual scenario, that was one of the scenarios in the Limits to Growth report, unfortunately, we follow more or less that scenario, which means that we are running into serious problems. Climate change is one problem, and the other one is, of course, the fact that ecosystems are degraded as we speak, and this cannot continue. And I think the elephant in the room is really the economic system, and in particular neoclassical or conventional economics, which still has not really understood the problems, and which still seems to look upon nature as more or less of a constant. And whenever they talk about problems in terms of pollution, etc., they talk about external effects, externalities, as if it was something very marginal. It's not marginal. It's the issue. So I think we have to challenge conventional economists And I think the European Commission is doing that through its new Green Deal. At least it's an attempt, and I think it's a very, very important attempt. But we have to rethink policy frameworks fundamentally if we are going to move in the right direction. And since material consumption is at the core of the problem, we have to start looking into that much more in depth than we have done. I know how difficult it is. Most policymakers don't want to touch about consumption and consumer lifestyles, etc. But it is the issue, and we have to tackle it. And when you look at material use going up like this, there are, of course, things we can do. The first one is to start using other indicators, not use GDP growth as the main indicator for progress in society, because it's a flawed concept. It's all about quantity, not about quality. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to initiate the broad discussion about what the hell is quality of life. Material consumption is an important part, but not the only part. There are so many other aspects of quality of life that we have to bring to the fore. Thirdly, we have to enhance resource efficiency across the board. Fourthly, we have to move from production models that are linear to more circular ones. There is nothing 100% circular, but that would be a move in the right direction. And then, of course, we can, in many areas, we can substitute materials for each other. For instance, building houses in wood would make a huge difference compared to steel and concrete. And finally, we have to meet human needs in a more intelligent way. And there, I think we have a lot of possibilities and move towards what I would call sufficiency and not overconsumption and wasteful consumption. So those were just a few comments.
And I'm glad that you are optimistic. I'm not. When I saw what happened last week, with due to the food crisis coming from Ukraine, and then they just say, well, we will speed up producing food or feed to animals and to cars, and we're not going to change that at all. And the protests, the political protests, of course, we had from some NGOs very strongly saying this here, but it was totally overruled. And I was really in shock. And this discussion on how we create an economic system where we can have a decrease in material privileges without the society turning into slum, where we don't see more unemployment and so on and so forth, is still at the table without being solved. And I think that we should be more tough in our language, and I think all of you are far too nice to the commission we have for the moment. They are, in my opinion, I've been here now in the parliament. You were elected before me, but I've been here now since 2004. It's the weakest commission I've seen when it comes to deeds, not words, but deeds. And then they are just stepping back, and there I really call for the political response to this here, because we cannot continue like this. We came forward with a report on circular economy. I was a shadow for the Greens last year. Everything is there, as we have seen it also after you rightly mentioned limits to growth, and we could even also mention here this beyond limits to growth, what came there. The knowledge is there, but the political will is so paralyzing what's going on. And I'm sorry for being that pessimistic. Of course I'm not, because I have to keep up hope, but I think we need to be very realistic on what we are facing. And when I saw last week that it could happen so quickly, and it was such an idiotic step which was taken, has nothing to do with food security, but only to keep privileges for those who are already now in good shape. So sorry for this, but I hope that we could come forward with some ideas to I don't know, to change mentality But as long as we don't really face but what you said, you know, inequality in the world, but also inequality in our own societies. And you and I are coming from countries where they still are willing to pay taxes. It's one of the steps which could be used much more, that we don't see taxes as punishment, but as clever investments, and these tools could be used much stronger as it is for the moment. But still, we need to keep up hope, but also realistic what is going on for the moment. But sorry to be so pessimistic. I'm still in shock for these events last week and how fast it went. Thank you.
Putting in the chat also the work under the Convention on Biological Diversity with climate. So please have a look in the chat. Thank you, Karin. And then going back to the conversation just now, yes, there is a huge disparity, and the inequality is alarming. And what we see, what we hear, what we read in the different assessment reports, but what we see in reality is that, of course, the most vulnerable are hit the most, and we see it in climate change impacts, but in every respect. So we do need to step up with the ambitions, and what we mentioned, the consumption that we have, the material consumption, that will not go away. It's massive, and it will continue to be massive with the population rate that we have at the moment. So we do have to be more sustainable about how we consume, how we produce, and that's where the transformation really has to come, and it has to. For the transformation, we have to have major shifts in policies, in governance, in regulations. And I agree with Margrete that we have a big push from society. Society is aware. I think that we have it much more than in the past years. But we really have to we have to step up on every possible level that we have. And so I mentioned the policies, governance, regulation, incentives and investments, but we have a quite unique opportunity now to get it right. We had the COVID crisis. EU member states have recovery and resilience plans. That's huge opportunity to invest in the right direction and to strive for reducing the inequalities. I probably should not even mention this, the elephant in the room, also the agricultural sector. There is the reform of common agricultural policy. Member states are putting forward the national plans. There is huge opportunity to have the real transformation process, and we really have to be honest about it. What can be achieved, but there are opportunities, and so there I totally agree with Margrete that there needs to be political will, political push to really change things, and the awareness is there, but we need to pull the strings together and make the decisions that are very much informed by science.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So I would like follow this transformational change, which was one of the highlights of the IBES global assessment in 2019, that we need a transformational change, which means that everybody should change at every level. We should change our values, our behavior, and of course all the private sector, government sector should change. So somehow we should change the system. And here I would like to tell a little story. When I was come back from the IPES meeting, and I tell that there are transformational changes needed, we need to change the system and so on. Some of my Hungarian friends were a little bit frightened that, hey, we just come out from the communist system. Do we really want to change system again? So we have to be very clear what kind of systematic change we need here. Actually, what we need here is to change the value system, change the flow of, let's say, subsidies according to that. So a redistribution of benefits and costs is needed more or less within the current system, but with different values and so on. Whether it's time or not for transformational change, well, all of us, I think, here agree that we're really in the need of this, but there are extreme strong vested interests, and yeah, it was raised that such, let's say, brutal changes occur if there are wars and other catastrophes, but actually we are living in the last few years and few days in such an environment with the pandemic, with many millions of people died, and also, at least at the economic level, we are participating in a war which started just a month ago. So there is the very bad and dramatic situation when transformational changes should happen. I have big concerns because I saw at the COVID pandemic, and also now that the step from the politicians and all those who have interest in the current system is to step back one, to release bans of pesticide use, to stop green steps and so on. But I think we should use this situation we have to use to step or proceed much faster to reach a more sustainable system in Europe and beyond. Thank you.
First of all, I think we seem to be in total agreement that we need systemic approaches, that everything is interlinked. And this means that part of the transformation, in my opinion, has to affect institutions in society. We don't have the right institutions. We have institutions for a linear economy and for a conventional growth economy. We don't have institutions for a sustainable economy. So that I think is a very, very important point. Secondly, we are not living any longer in the more traditional or conventional industrial society. We are moving into a society with a lot of disruptive technologies, information technology, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, etc., etc. These technologies are already changing a lot. And there are some opportunities, but also a lot of risks linked to these technologies. And I think they have to be at center stage in the transformation. Thirdly, I think values will be very important. And I refer to quality of life. I mean, if you ask a human being in the street, most of them wouldn't name material consumption as the most important thing in life. At the same time, all policies are geared towards that, to increase material consumption. And that is an impossibility. It was okay as long as we were 2 or 3 billion people on this planet, and nature was still abundantly large. That's no longer the case. And the problem is, as I said before, 3 to 4 billion people are still dirt poor. So some kind of dramatic change has to happen. But I think here again, some of the technologies may help us, because technologies today can offer people experiences that are not really material in nature as a substitute. So I think we have to really try to understand how technologies can help in this context. Then one of the disturbing things is, of course, that if you look at carbon emissions today, more than 50% of carbon emissions are generated by 10% of the top income takers. If you take the 1% top income takers in the world, they make up almost 20% of carbon emissions. And if you start looking into the really rich people, I saw a figure for Abramovich the other day. I think it was 12,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. I mean, here is something we have to touch upon. We have to deal with. How can we ask from ordinary people to really be careful if those with a lot of purchasing power live in their own world, so to say. So I think this is something that policy making has to address. Finally, I think what is positive when it comes to agriculture, which of course is at the core of biodiversity laws, is that there are so many examples now that regenerative or conservation agriculture means a lot of difference and would build carbon in the soils, would protect soils much better, and also reduce many of the problems related to pesticides, fertilizers, but also biodiversity loss. So there are some very positive examples that we could pursue and that would reduce all the problems that we are talking about. Final comment, I'm just now involved in a rather intense debate in Sweden about mining. And this is a question to all of us. Have you really thought about the fact that a mining company pays more or less nothing for the right to mine? Once they have the concession, they start the mining operation, and they earn all the revenue on that. It is as if what is buried in the crust of the earth, the ores, etc., as if it was owned by the company as soon as they have a concession. I think that those ores and those wealths, they belong to all of us. And there should be a definite fee that could then go into a state coffer and then could be distributed uniformly to the citizens. That's being practiced in the state of Alaska. And it's a very good example. It's a so-called universal basic dividend. And by doing it this way also, you would give a boost to the circular economy. Because the problem today is that in most areas, it's cheaper to source virgin materials than it is to source secondary materials. And as long as this is the case, you're not going to move from linear to circular production. Because linear production is more beneficial, more profitable. And we have to change that. And by imposing fees and taxes on the use of nature, that is going to happen in the right way. I'm going to sound a little bit like Margrete, that I'm quite pessimistic. And not least today in a situation where Russia is in aggressive mood in Ukraine and blocking any action in the United Nations because of its veto power. I'm not very optimistic, at least not in the short term. And you need the big countries to play along, of course. And one of the problems with Russia is, of course, that Russia depends for its economy a lot on oil and gas, but also on some of the minerals, and to some extent also on wheat production and sunflower. So Russia is very dependent on the kind of economy we have today. I don't think they like at all the concept of a circular economy. They don't like at all the concept of a renewable energy economy because it's against their economic interests. So here we have another very difficult barrier or hurdle to pass. But I agree with you. A resilience kind of entity with no veto power would be fantastic to deal with all these other risks. Absolutely.
Following up on the transformation that we're speaking about now, about the whole economic system, that's probably the real elephant in the room. I'm working for biodiversity conservation for 20 years, and sometimes I have the feeling that probably it's a hard thing to say, but if you work for really tackling the consumption, and the second big elephant in the room is population, of course, those are probably the key issues that will tackle any environmental issue. And those are probably the big challenges. Now, if we come more to, if you want, the reality or the challenges that we can really tackle, I will all the time go to the same, the economic sectors. And this is not just to change economic sectors, but rather to initiate, at this point we have to initiate it quickly, but to have a conversation with the relevant economic sectors to ensure that this transformation is happening. And we are speaking about some of these sectors at the moment. Agriculture is one of the one that comes all the time. Let's remember anyway that first of all, there is a lot of sustainable agriculture happening at the moment. And also that we can't say that a sector is not the case actually. A sector is not bad per se. It's actually absolutely necessary and fundamental. Agriculture, we all eat and we need that food. But to have this conversation, to start to see how we can make this transformation happen with the sectors, that's probably a key issue. One of the focus that we have from IUCN is to discuss with absolutely every stakeholder. I mean, really absolutely every stakeholder, to try to help in this transformation, to have a dialogue to understand, or make understand if you want, to ensure that at the very end there is ownership over the environmental targets also from these sectors, that it's not only belonging to the conservation sector, if you want to see it this way. So at the very end, I think that we are speaking about the same all the time. This is a system change and it is the involvement of everybody.
So I was thinking when Mr. Wijkman made his comment about the mining in Sweden and everywhere, that actually with natural capital accounting, we have instruments which are quite well suited actually to take this use of natural resources into account. And it's fully being developed now with a new standard being adopted by the UN since last year. It's the so-called SIA standard on natural capital accounting, which is now being used, and for instance also in the context of Eurostat, who is developing methods to take the use of natural capital into account. So I think that these kind of new data-based techniques, which they benefit actually of the huge amount of data that we have on natural capital, the use of it, that this could help actually to at least point on the real cost of using these natural resources, and finally to put actually the cost of all this to the people who use it or who provoke the cost. So I think that natural capital accounting is simply one of the tools that we have in hand that are being developed to help tackling these problems. That's what I wanted to add to the discussion.
Okay, Ron, I very much agree with that. If I may come in, and that's long been overdue. So I agree to try to assess all the capital stocks in a country. Some people don't like to call nature natural capital, but for the simplicity to at least within the economic system deal with it, I think it's a step in the right direction. And there have been several reports recently which have helped advance that agenda. Mm-hmm. But the other side of the coin is, of course, should a corporation, should a company be allowed to make use of that natural capital without paying any fees, any taxes? I don't think so. No. I think that's one of the big mistakes. So corporations make use of what we could say the global commons, and there should be a fee, and that fee should go into a coffin, and the revenues should be distributed uniformly among the citizens. You can imagine what a change, what a difference it would mean. Mm-hmm. And we should apply it not only to nature, we should apply it to data and the information technology domain, where these big tech companies use our data without paying fees. They should pay a fee, and the whole system would look different. And it's not about taxing the rich. It's about making a fair system when somebody is using something that is wealth generating and that belongs to the commons. The irony is that the most capitalistic society on earth, the United States of America, they have had a debate on this for quite some time. And at least one of the states is applying this principle. So I think it could really be implemented widely. And I think most people would look upon it as fair.
on taxing resources, taxing the CO2. Just to analyze, it's not to tax the rich. You're just saying you get the protest there because the consumption there is very high, and suddenly you get lots of protest. But taxation, so we mean that we have a globalization where we really use each other in the good way, knowledge, have a solidarity with sharing solutions, and also using exchange of products as long as they don't undermine the natural capital in the world. I think still that's helpful, and that's good that we could get to know each other. But when we, for instance, look into the sea, we haven't talked very much about the sea, but that is really one of the really tough problems. I can tell you, probably that 70% of the seabed around Denmark, which is very important not only for the Baltic but for the whole European part, is dead now, and that has so much to do with that the pollution doesn't cost pollution from nitrogens, and also the trawl fishing, and all this destruction doesn't cost anything. The world's greatest transport company, Maersk, they are still using bunker oil, which is also polluting like, sorry for my language, a heavy word, and they still do this because they don't pay anything for that kind of yes, it's destroying our life. So you could easily, if there was a will to identify where we have these heavy problems, and then make a polluter pays, a fair system at a good level, then we could also help poor countries, because their consumption of CO2 and all these things are very low compared to what's happened by us, so they could really help. And then I think that we also should perhaps also address that those who go to a trustworthy innovation should have the support for that. But I don't think that an attack on globalization would be a helpful thing. But I think that the attack of unfair consumption and unfair distribution and done by a fair taxation system will be a great help. And of course also at the same time to combat tax havens and all these things which are also contributing to the injustice in the world, which also contribute to destabilization. And there, wars, I don't know, the war in Ukraine is probably not so much about lack of natural resources, but it can easily be, when we see it occur much more from Africa, occurring from other countries too. And we have to take that much more serious than we do today, not by an anti-globalization strategy, but by a much more, fairness, polluter pay, and knowledge about how all these things are interlinked. Thank you.
Be short, just to reflect on the international cooperation. I am convinced that multilateralism, international cooperation is needed today more than ever before. We are facing multiple crises, and the magnitude, what is happening now in Europe is of course very tragic. But we should not forget about the planetary crisis that will not disappear, and the magnitude is getting bigger and bigger, and this is the time that we have to act absolutely urgently. It's already late, but we have to really step up, and we should not slip away from the climate and biodiversity targets, because we don't have second chance. We don't have a second chance to save the planet. So we have to trust the international community. We have to talk to each other. We have to listen to each other. I apologize. I keep saying we, but it just automatically comes to my mind. But really, multilateralism is very important. We have to work with that, and that's the only chance that we have. And it's all in the common agenda that Ronnie referred to earlier. And I thank you very much for this opportunity to be here with you today.
About this question about the globalization, well, if we understand it as multilateralists. I think I agree with Veronika. It's not that we need less, we need more. The cooperation is fundamental. But if globalization is understood as a way to continue our production and consumption, well, that's not the way to go, absolutely, of course. There is also another point here about the global responsibility, or the responsibility, and sorry for the simplification, from the global north to the global south, if you want, in terms of finance, knowledge, technology, etc. It's also something to put into the table when it comes to discussions about international issues. And maybe just two very quick points, and with that I will finish, about what was mentioned about the natural capital accounting. First of all, it is needed and it is positive. And actually we are waiting for the Commission to come up with the model that will be going to the Parliament soon, we hope, and that will be a way to step forward in the European Union. But of course, we are all the time speaking about value in nature, not about putting a price to nature. That's always the challenge here. And finally, a very last word to, I would say, to Margrete and to maybe the rest of colleagues from the Parliament. I understand the challenging times we are living and the challenges to keep optimistic, but if you want a pledge here, we need all the political actors at the moment to be very optimistic and full of energy. We are ready to help, but it's an enormous responsibility, probably what you have from the MEP side. Thank you.
Going back to the report of Club of Rome, going back to the first big UN conference on environmental issues, so 50 years back, half century, with increasing globalization, and where we are now, biodiversity declining, climate problems increasing. So whether is this good to stay on this path, or shall we try a less globalized one? I don't know. Thank you.
But we need also to rethink globalization from a number of aspects. Fairness, not least the trade system, but also how economies should be organized, in particular low-income countries, to really have a chance. So a lot of the rules of the game have to be reconsidered, I think. But of course, we need cooperation. That's for sure. We started with the interconnectedness of everything. And since we are so interconnected, and the pandemic has shown it very, very clearly, of course, to prevent new crisis situations, we need much better cooperation. So that would be my last comment. Thank you.